As we mentioned in previous lessons, we can use the policy model to create any type of network that we want to. In this case, one of the easiest ways to start using ACI and getting all the benefits of the zero-touch configuration, of the visibility, of added security, of easier upgrades, of using a controller to program your network is by implementing ACI in what we call network-centric mode. This is where we take our traditional network, we lift it up, and we put it on ACI. We still get a ton of benefits, but we're deploying ACI on a VLAN by VLAN basis, which makes it very easy just to migrate devices over to ACI. Now, how do we do that? Well, first thing we have to do is create a tenant. This tenant could be our production tenant, and every tenant requires a context or a VRF, so we create one of those. And then we start creating our VLANs. In order to do that, we create a bridge domain, and under the bridge domain, we create a subnet and a default gateway for VLAN 10. We then create a group associated with that bridge domain. That group is also called VLAN 10, and then we start putting devices in it. For instance, bare metal servers and virtual servers. We then continue on with all the VLANs in our infrastructure, for instance, VLAN 20 and VLAN 30. We create bridge domains for each of those subnets and default gateways. We put our VLAN 20 in the VLAN 20 bridge domain. We put our VLAN 30 in the VLAN 30 bridge domain. And then we allow all of our VLANs to talk to each other with a contract. In this case, I just want to mirror my current network, so I'm actually going to use a any-to-any contract, which allows any communication from any VLAN to any other VLAN. At that point, I would connect ACI to my current network through a layer 3 external interface or a routed interface, or a layer 2 external interface or a trunking interface, and allow communication in and out of the fabric through the leaves. So it'd be very easy for me to connect servers to my leaves and allow them to interact with the existing network through my layer 3 external connection from the leaf to my traditional network, or a layer 2 external connection from a leaf to my existing network. So as you can see, it's very easy to start up and get going with ACI in network-centric mode and just take my existing VLANs and move them into ACI. Now, if I didn't want ACI to do the routing for these VLANs, I could simply create my bridge domain without the routing enabled and without a subnet assigned to it. If I did that, when I plugged in my devices, my physical servers and my virtual devices, they would use the layer 2 external trunk link to talk out to my existing network and use the routing that's already running inside my existing network. When I'm ready to take advantage of more performance or move the routing into the ACI network, at that point I would configure the routing inside of ACI by assigning that subnet to the bridge domain. I would shut down the routed interface in my traditional network. I would turn up the routed interface inside of ACI. I would start advertising that network out my layer 3 connection to the rest of my infrastructure. Now that we've heard all about network-centric mode in ACI, let's go see how we would actually implement that on the device. Here I'm logging into my Cisco APIC controller, and I'm going to go ahead and log into basic mode, and we covered the difference between basic and advanced mode in previous lessons. When I log into basic mode, it's going to bring me to my Fabric Inventory tab. And in this case, I'm actually going to go into my Tenants tab, and I'm going to create a new tenant, and we're going to call that tenant CCNA Data Center. But before that, I want to mention a couple of other tenants that come with the system by default. The first one is this infra tenant, and the infra tenant is actually the internal network to ACI, so the internal VXLAN and layer 3 configuration that happens between all the leaves and spines is actually happening in the infra VLAN. There's also a management tenant that handles our in-band and out-of-band management configuration in more detail. And when I get more advanced configurations for my in-band and out-of-band management, I want to handle that inside of the management tenant. Finally, there's the common tenant. And the common tenant is where we put resources that we want other tenants to be able to use. Normally when we create a tenant, we're creating an area that needs to be administered separately, or have separate resources, or have separate contracts or separate policies that we don't want to share with other business units or other companies or other networks. In this case, if I do have things that I want to share, such as policies that I want to reuse over and over again, resources like firewalls that everybody should have access to, common exits to the fabric where everybody can use the same connection out of the fabric, I would put those items in the common tenant, and my other tenants would be able to use some of those items. So let's go ahead and create our tenant. And to do that, I'm going to go to Actions, Create Tenant. I'm going to give my tenant a name, which is CCNA Data Center. And as we discussed before, for any tenant you have to create a VRF, which in this case is also going to be CCNA Data Center. Go ahead and click Submit. It's going to bring me into that tenant where I can start to configure the network. As we discussed with network-centric mode, when you create a VLAN or bring a VLAN into ACI, we create a bridge domain to associate that subnet with. So in this case, I'm going to create VLAN 10 and VLAN 20. And in that case, I need two different bridge domains, one for VLAN 10 and one for VLAN 20. Now, in order to create those bridge domains, it's very easy. I simply click on this circle that says BD, I drag it down here, and I associate it with the VRF. And you can see that it's associated by that green line. When it's in the right place, I let it go, and it brings me into the screen to create the bridge domain. In this case, I'm going to name my bridge domain VLAN 10. Now, if this was just a layer 2 network inside the fabric, meaning that I didn't want the fabric to do any routing on VLAN 10, maybe I just have a trunk connection coming in from my existing network into ACI, this would be all the configuration that I'd need to do. But because I'm going to actually have ACI do the routing for me, I'm actually going to go to this Layer 3 Configuration tab. I'm going to make sure that unicast routing is enabled, and then I'm going to add a subnet or a default gateway for VLAN 10. In this case, it's going to be 172.16.10.1 is going to be my default gateway, and I'm going to put a /24 after it for the subnetting. I press OK, I press OK again, and now I've created the bridge domain for VLAN 10. So any group that I associate with this bridge domain is going to be able to use that default gateway. And in this case, I only plan on associating one group, which is going to be a group called VLAN 10. But let's go ahead and make our second bridge domain, which is going to be VLAN 20. I do the exact same thing. I give it a name. I go to my Layer 3 configuration, make sure unicast routing is enabled. I add a default gateway and a subnet. And I say OK. Now I have two bridge domains on my fabric, which I can now place groups into. So I'm going to click Submit down here at the bottom. Once I do that, I'm ready to go ahead and configure an application and groups underneath that application. In this case, because I'm doing network-centric mode, my application is actually going to be my traditional network. So I'm going to right-click on my application profile. I'm going to create an application profile, and I'm going to call it Traditional Network. I'm then going to say Submit. Once I've created that application, I can expand the menu on the left and highlight that application, and I get to a drag and drop window again, where I can very easily start to create policy. Now up in the left-hand corner, you can see different bubbles that I can drag and drop onto the screen. The first one is a contract, and we talked about contracts are what allows communication between groups. The second one is what we call an endpoint group. These are the groups that we create and we put devices in it. The third one is a special group, a microsegmentation group, where I can place devices in that group based on very intricate details such as their IP address, such as the name of the device, and things like that. The fifth one over here is a bare metal object, and that's how I actually put things like servers in certain groups. I also have objects for VMware servers, for Microsoft Hyper-V servers, or for OpenStack servers. And then I have bubbles for my Layer 2 and my Layer 3 out. So let's start creating our policy. My policy is going to include two different groups. It's VLAN 10 and VLAN 20. So I'm going to start by dragging my group down here and giving it a name. I'm going to call this VLAN 10. Now once I create a group, I have to pick which bridge domain I'm assigning it with, and I already created a bridge domain called VLAN 10, which includes the gateway for all these devices. I'm going to go ahead and press OK. The next thing I'm going to do is drag another bubble down here, and I'm going to call that VLAN 20. I'm going to do the same thing, associate this with the gateway for VLAN 20. And that's pretty much it. I've now created VLAN 10 and VLAN 20, and the one interesting thing is I've created this across my whole network. Once I press submit, I can push this configuration across all the devices in my network. So that could be 4 switches, or that could be 50 switches. And with just a couple of clicks, I've now added my VLANs to my network. If I want to allow these VLANs to talk to each other, I have to create a contract. Now the contract can be as open or as restrictive as you want to be. In network-centric mode, quite often we see contracts that are very open in regards to any device can talk to any other device on any other VLAN, because that is very similar to how people deploy their networks today. Now that's not the way you have to deploy it. You can definitely be more restrictive if you'd like to be. But for this example, we're going to go ahead and configure in any contract. So I drag my contract down here, I associate it with VLAN 10 and VLAN 20, and I let it go. It brings up the contract configuration window, and in here I'm going to name my contract VLAN Communication, and I'm going to choose not to filter the traffic between them, and then I'm going to press OK and submit. Now that I've done that, I've done all the routing and switching that's required to allow VLAN 10 and VLAN 20 to communicate with each other. And it becomes much easier to add an additional VLAN as I go along, because now I can actually start reusing that same contract over and over again. I'll show you what I mean by adding VLAN 30. Go to Bridge Domains, go to Networking, grab a bridge domain, I drag it down here, associate it with my VRF, I call it VLAN 30, I add a gateway for VLAN 30, I say OK, I say OK again, press submit. I then go to my application, my traditional network. I drag another group down here. I name it VLAN 30. Associate it with my new bridge domain or default gateway for VLAN 30. Press submit. And now when I drag my contract down here, for instance, associated with VLAN 20 and 30, I have the choice to reuse my known good policy. In this case, I can choose an existing contract, click the down arrow, choose my VLAN communication contract, say OK, press submit, and I'm done. So basically with 3 steps, I added a new VLAN, allowed it to route and switch across my network anywhere inside my fabric. Now last but not least, if I want to add a host to my VLAN, it's very simple. I simply navigate to the Fabric tab. Now once I'm in the Fabric tab, I can add hosts to the network. The first thing that I need to do is tell ACI which VLANs my hosts will be using to connect to the network. So I have to create what we call a VLAN domain. I can select VLAN domains. I can right click on that, say create VLAN domain, give it a name, tell them that this is a static allocation because I'm going to be doing the allocation, click plus to add a range. So in this case, I just literally add a range of VLANs. This is almost like a switch port trunk allowed command where I'm telling it that these are the VLANs that are going to be coming up the link to me. So in my case, I'm going to be allowing VLAN 10 to VLAN 30 because I'm bringing in VLAN 10, VLAN 20, and VLAN 30. I say update, I say submit, and now I can go back to my topology, hit the configure button here on the top right, and start adding devices into those groups that I created. So I'm going to hit add switches. I highlight leaf 101 and leaf 102 because these are the 2 switches that I'm going to be adding devices to. I say add, and in this case I'm going to add, for instance, a Oracle server. And my Oracle server is going to be attached to port 42 on leaf 101 and port 42 on leaf 102, and I want to configure this in a VPC, so I hit configure VPC. I then give this a name, Oracle servers, and finally I click on this VLAN tab and I choose the new VLAN domain I just created, which is bare metal hosts, which is allowed to use VLANs 10 through 30. I then click plus and I say if I see a VLAN from the host on this port, I want to put it in this group. For instance, I'm putting it into the CCNA data center tenant. I'm putting it in my traditional network. I'm putting it in VLAN 10, and it's going to be anything that I see coming on the link on VLAN 10. I say update. I can do the same thing and configure this for other servers, or if this is a trunk link where the server will be sending information on more than one VLAN, I would then hit the plus here and do the same thing over again, where I say it's going to go into my traditional network, VLAN 20, for things that come into the switch on VLAN 20. And that's it. Once I apply the changes, that physical server is now up and running in VLAN 10 and VLAN 20. And I've configured it in a VPC, and if I go back to the tenant, the great part about this is if I go back to my tenant, my CCNA data center tenant, I am now tracking the health of that tenant and the health of those applications inside of that tenant. So I can see here that I actually have an issue. The health of my tenant is actually 0 because I've configured my traditional network to be looking for traffic on VLAN 10 and VLAN 20 on a host that the ports are down because there's no host connected to it. So right now the only host in my network is down. So the system thinks I need to know about that, and it's telling me all about that. So the system is giving me a 0 for a health score. Please join me for the next lesson, 9.7, Examining Application-Centric Mode.